It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Earlier this month, we launched an occasional series that we're calling America 251, Dialogue, Not Diatribe. America 251 because after the polarized bitterness of the country's 250th birthday year, let's actually listen to each other in year 251. Dialogue, not diatribe, as a perennial value of the show and of public radio generally, as we will continue to try to be a place where people who disagree with each other in good faith do actually listen to each other and interact in a constructive way. And as it turns out, the divisions in this country are not just Democrat versus Republican, or right versus left, or even insider versus outsider, or rich versus not rich. Today, tomorrow, and Wednesday, we'll explore, we hope in a smart way, some current divisions within the conservative movement, within the Democratic Party, and within DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and that's where we'll start. Even as DSA politicians like Zoran Mamdani, Milat Kiros, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others rise in prominence and influence, the DSA is engaged in determining exactly what it wants to be as it tries to actually win elections and then to actually govern rather than just be a kind of left-wing think tank or activist group. For example, Axios had an article a couple of weeks ago called "The DSA has had unprecedented success. It also has serious internal divisions." The New York Times this month had a story about the DSA National Summit in Chicago, where members, quote, debated whether socialist candidates should be free to distance themselves from goals like abolishing prisons as they chase more seats this fall, unquote, from the Times. And maybe you've heard this 45-second clip of DSA National Co-Chair Megan Romer being widely shared on social media now after her appearance on Fox.
So we're going to put up on the screen a few of the things that are part of your platform, and I want to ask you, just give me sort of a true or false on these. Abolish the Senate.
True.
Okay. Replace the presidency and Supreme Court as we now know them.
Yep.
Abolish ICE.
Absolutely.
Abolish borders and give amnesty to anyone currently in the U.S. illegally.
As a long-term plan, yep.
Defund the Pentagon.
Absolutely.
Abolish prisons, at least in large part.
Yeah, again, that as part of a long-term program, yeah.
Okay, so no prisons. Government or public ownership of most large corporations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Megan Romer, DSA National Co-Chair with Fox's Shannon Bream. Certainly you haven't heard words like most of those from Mamdani or Ocasio-Cortez, for example. In fact, and many people don't know this, the national DSA withdrew its endorsement of AOC 2 years ago. We'll explain why. So let's explore the dialogue taking place within the DSA right now with Eric Blank, Assistant Professor of Labor Studies at Rutgers, author of several books, including We Are the Union, How Worker-to-Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big, published last year, and his 2019 book, Red State Revolt, The Teachers' Strike Wave and Working Class Politics. He writes the Substack newsletter, Labor Politics, and is a member of the DSA's Bread and Roses Caucus. Which caucus of the DSA he is in will be relevant during our conversation. Eric, always good to have you on with us. Welcome back to WNYC.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. And as a disclaimer, I should say that this is me not speaking in name of Bread and Roses, but in an individual capacity.
Fair enough. And DSA listeners, you're invited to be an integral part of this segment. How close is your agenda to what Megan Romer laid out in the clip? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. Call or text if you consider yourself a democratic socialist. What, if any, litmus tests do you think should apply to a candidate for office if they want to call themselves DSA members? Are you enthusiastic about AOC for president, or maybe less so, like reportedly, according to the New York Times at least, many of the people at that recent DSA summit in Chicago? 212-433 WNYC, or anything else relevant you want to say or ask or have a dialogue about with Eric Blank, 212-433 9692, call or text. And again, this is for those of you who consider yourselves Democratic Socialists. You don't have to be formal DSA members, but you have to at least think of yourself as a Democratic Socialist. Tomorrow, we'll do something similar for those of you from any wing of the Democratic Party. And on Wednesday, for those of you who consider yourselves conservatives, some of the conversations within that movement. But for today, Democratic Socialist with Eric Blank from Rutgers and the National, from Rutgers and the Nation, and sometimes writing for Jacobin, and from the Bread and Roses caucus of DSA. Eric, we'll try to get to the viral Megan Romer clip in just a minute and its implications. But, and I know you gave us that disclaimer, can we establish first where you are within the party? I see you are a member of the Bread and Roses caucus. You acknowledge that. Would you describe what that is and its role in DSA as you see it?
Sure. I think the most useful way to frame the divisions in DSA is there's, broadly speaking, a right wing and a left wing. And, this is within the context of DSA. So these are very relative terms, right? And overall, I would consider myself mostly sympathetic to the right wing. Bread and Roses is a sort of a center current, but I'm on the right wing of Bread and Roses. So this gives you a sense of how complicated it is. So broadly speaking, on the right, people, they would self-identify more as mass politics, trying to sort of reach out as broadly speaking in a way that makes is more legible maybe to the broader numbers of people. And I think on the left, the way they would see it is that they would see themselves as maybe more consistently revolutionary, more consistently socialist, as they would look at, less prone to co-optation. That's how I think they self-identify. And those, broadly speaking, I think the big divide is between the left and right, and some of the internal nuances are a little bit secondary to that.
For all your appearances on this show, one thing I never thought I'd hear was you referring to yourself as right wing.
That's very relative.
But
yes,
I understand the context. So what did you think of that Megan Romer clip? How much does that represent you, or should people take it as representing where DSA candidates in the midterms as a group want to take the country generally if you scratch below the surface?
I think, put it this way, I think that DSA has this amazing opportunity at this moment to give a voice and organize, literally hundreds of thousands of people, potentially millions. That's the kind of scale that socialist parties in the rest of the world or in the US in the past have aspired to and oftentimes achieved. And my criticism of that Megan Romer clip and some of the sort of similar things that have been said from maybe more the left wing of DSA is that I think that it's falling into a trap which is being set by establishment on both conservative and liberals, which is to try to paint DSA as quite extreme. And so we can go into some of the specifics of like which of those points I agree with or not. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk about the particulars. But I think that the basic point is that when we go on national news, whether it's, Fox or the New Yorker or whatever, that's an opportunity to say, like, actually, Democratic Socialists are the only political current, in our view, that has a solution to the crisis that ordinary working people are facing. The affordability crisis, the crisis of political democracy, all of these things that are felt immediately. And when we get into the train of like distant debates of what, this or that could happen down the road, that's the train that I think the Democratic establishment wants us to be fighting on. That's the terrain that the Republican establishment wants to be fighting on. And what I think we need to do in things like, if we're going on Fox or that, is to pivot very consistently to saying, actually, look at what Zoran has done. That is because we believe in working class power. We're fighting for the interests of working class people. It's very pragmatic. We're winning free expanded childcare. We're winning rent freeze. And I think if you can't pivot to the ways that we're going to make a difference in people's lives, then you're only going to appeal, I think, to like the radical activists. And right now we have an opportunity to speak much more widely. And we're seeing that in the votes we're getting for our candidates. But I don't think that we're seeing that articulated as consistently as could be from some of our national leaders.
It sounds like you're saying Megan Romer blew it on Fox.
I certainly would not have argued in the way that she did. I'm trying to be as nice as possible. But yeah, I don't think that is an approach that's going to be able to build the type of power we need to win the types of changes that like American people and working class people deserve.
So here's an example I think, of the position that statements like that put some of the actual candidates for office in. This is an exchange I had with Democratic Congressman Tom Suozzi, who represents a swing district in Queens and Long Island. You probably know he's been making a point of calling himself a Democratic capitalist, and he made his point in an exchange with me partly like this.
It's important to look at what the Democratic Socialists include in their platform. And what they tell you what they believe in, we should believe them.
But that's the premise of my question. There is a national DSA that has these policies on paper, these policies, what you call the platform specifics on paper. Then there's Iran Mamdani, Bernie Sanders, others in real life politics who I think it's fair to say are not advocating the most extreme things that you were just citing.
I don't think it's fair to say that because they should need to be asked those questions. How do they feel about, for example, the Chinese Communist Party? I'm the founder and the co-chair of the Uyghur Caucus. The Uyghurs are Muslim minorities that are held in forced labor camps in China. Why don't we ask Mayor Mamdani, does he support what the Chinese are doing with the Muslim minority in China? Does he support the idea of abolishing the Senate or abolishing the presidency or defunding the police or getting rid of the Department of Defense or these other really extreme things?
He's in office governing now for 6 months, and I don't think I've heard him talk about any of those things.
Well, why don't you ask him specifically the next time you have him on your show? Does he want to get rid of prisons altogether? I mean, that's part of the platform. I mean, I've been in politics for a long time. I've been on your show many times. I'm held accountable for the things that I stand for. I'm held accountable for the platform of the party that I represent.
Well, does it say something to you that he just declined to defund the police? In fact, he ran on keeping the numbers steady in NYPD headcount. So that went on for a while more with Congressman Suozzi and me last month. And, so I was drawing the distinction between what Mamdani ever talks about or has been doing as mayor and the DSA platform positions that Suozzi was spotlighting, more like some of the things in the Megan Romer clip and some other things that he raised there. But you see his argument, Eric, right? That every DSA candidate has to have a position on those positions because they're on paper in the platform, and now that was before Megan Romer went on Fox, so now we have that too. So are purity tests taking place within the party or just abstract debates about how socialist is socialist enough in 2026 America?
So the first thing I would say is that in the chapters of DSA that are electing, people across the country or electing mayors in New York City DSA, there's actually not so much division. And so some of this is really, I think, quite bad faith because there's not a lot of light in between the politics of Zoran Mamdani and New York City DSA, for instance, its leadership. So these types of divisions that we're talking about in many ways are between the chapters that I would consider to have proven themselves to be able to do mass politics by electing large numbers of people, but also by growing. Those tend to be the chapters that you have electing, these prominent politicians. And the debates tend to be on a national level with chapters that just frankly haven't been achieving those forms of success. Mm-hmm. And in part because of that, tend to have more extreme positions. So I don't think that there's so much division actually between the politicians and the chapters that they're accountable to. DSA is not a very centralized organization. I mean, that's a understatement. It's a very decentralized organization. The national DSA is actually quite weak. And so the real power is in the chapters. And so if you look on a chapter by chapter basis, this discrepancy is a lot less. I would say, though, that I think the concern that you flag is a very real one. And I think that, frankly, is just a mistake and bad that national DSA took certain positions that I think are both marginalizing for us and just wrong. So just to give a concrete example, I don't think it's plausible to say that we're even for the long term abolishing the police or prisons. I don't think that even as a socialist in the distant socialist future, I think you can imagine there'll be some sort of, some sort of apparatus for that. And so particularly at this moment, though, when you know that taking a position on that is going to provide so much fuel to all of those trying to discredit our, elected officials and our candidates, why do that? In what world would it make sense if your goal is to organize millions of people and to speak to millions and to overcome the Democratic Party establishment? Why take a position that is just going to give fuel to your opponents, for which there's no practical upshot right now? There's not a mass movement right now to defund the police or to abolish prisons. So it's just like the idea of taking an ideological position for the sake of it seems to me a reflection of a lack of experience and a lack of engagement in mass politics. So I think basically you're right. I think your concern is a correct one. The nuance, though, is that those aren't positions being taken by the actual chapters, for the most part, that are electing these candidates, right? It's a national DSA, oftentimes kind of self-selecting activists against the will, oftentimes of the chapters that are actually electing these candidates. So again, I do think that the way to look at DSA and these debates is that there's a high degree of unevenness between those who are, electing prominent politicians and doing this type of mass growth, and those who are newer to politics. And I would say it's a positive in this sense. Like I want to say a defensive DSA, including with, people on the left of DSA who I have like serious disagreements. There's very few spaces in national or local politics today where people can debate. And, so it's good to your show that this is one of the places where people can debate. But where else can you join an organization where you can have real substantive differences on that? And so I think that's to DSA's credit, that if you're a new person, oftentimes people were liberals like a week ago, and then they get radicalized because they're like, oh my goodness, Obama didn't do what he was going to do, Hillary Clinton lost. And then they flip their position, they kind of go too far in the other extreme. I had those positions when I was 18 or 19. It's understandable that sometimes people exaggerate in the opposite direction. And so there is a learning curve. And I think that it's disingenuous, frankly, for the opponents of DSA to try to pick and choose this or that position, when in fact it's not actually the reality of what our candidates and what our most important chapters are doing.
Sally in Manhattan, you're on WNYC with Eric Blank.
Hi there. I can't hear you anymore. I just turned off my radio. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you can hear me down the phone, right?
Okay. Yeah, perfect. Yep. Yes. I think it's naive to say that what's happening now with Megan Romer is there are definitely two sides to the Democratic Socialist group. And I have always been a Bernie Sanders supporter, AOC. They go for FDR. They go for Scandinavian socialism, which includes capitalism and socialism together. Whole different group. Megan Romer is an avowed Marxist, which is why Trump is now saying that communists are in the left side. She wants production to be in the hands of the people. She wants to get rid of capitalism. And I think we can't say that I think she's actually trying to split the Social Democrats, and that's her purpose is to minimize the movement. And I think we have to not be naive about this and call her out and call out her and the group that is doing this, as opposed to the Bernie Sanders AOC kind of Social Democrat. And so I think this is a very serious thing, and thank God you're bringing up this issue, because they're not all the same people, and it's not all one movement right now. She is seriously trying to split the movement.
Sally, thank you very much. Eric, do you agree with her analysis that Megan Romer is intentionally trying to split the movement?
No, I don't think it's intentional. I think that in practice, it does undermine the movement, and it does in practice lead to all sorts of divisions. I mean, the left of DSA, one of the things that I've seen that I've found to be particularly counterproductive is it spends a huge amount of time, or has a disproportionate amount of time, sort of attacking the stances or positions of our candidates or elected officials, or pushing back on it. And so I do think that there's some level of factionalism that is driven by that. But, their goal isn't to divide things per se. The way they look at it is, look, people are disenchanted with politics as usual. What we have as socialist people, the reason they think, people are coming to say, which I think there's a kernel of truth to this, is that we stand for something different than what's been on offer for decades, and that we don't make the same compromises that, the Democratic establishment constantly does. And so if we start going down that slippery slope, then we're just going to be like any other Democrat. Now, I think that the conclusions they draw from that analysis are wrong. I think they go too far. But there's a kernel of truth to that. And so I don't think that you have to assume that people are acting in bad faith or trying to split to say that in practice, the politics and the way they're going about it is undermining and making it harder for democratic socialism, and which to my mind means fighting centrally for social democracy in the mid-range. We're never going to get to an economic democracy or socialism.
Well, you say
if we can't
social
win something like
democracy.
Scandinavia.
The caller also cited that term, social democrats. And in fact, I want to play a clip of DSA candidate Daria-Liza Avila-Chevalier from an appearance on this show. This is after she won her primary. And I asked her what country, if any, she sees as a model of democratic socialism that the U.S. could emulate if DSA gains enough influence. Here's 30 seconds of her answer.
There's a lot we can learn from many parts of the world. I think places in Europe, like Sweden and Norway, for example. But I think looking specifically at the programs themselves, like what are the models of the programs and how can we implement them here, are how I envision this, right? And I think the other thing that gets lost is that is a democratic part of this phrase, democratic socialism, right? Is that we are making decisions in a democratic way about how we use the wealth that we have produced in this society, because the people who are producing the wealth are the people who produce the labor, the workers.
Daria-Liza Avila-Chevalier here. Are you surprised she cited the Scandinavian model? We know that in her old tweets that she mostly has disavowed now. She says she's grown. She sounded more like Megan Romer on some points. But my understanding is DSA says there's a difference between social democracy. You and the caller and Ms. Chevalier all use that term, social democracy, and democratic socialism. That democratic socialism goes further than European-style social democracy. Can you explain how true that is and how much you think it should matter in the current context?
Yeah, I think it doesn't matter so much in the current context, like what words you use. But for what it's worth, the parties that won the most robust welfare states, so if we want to call that social democracy, Sweden, Norway, et cetera, a lot of Western Europe, they were for the most part socialists. They were what we call democratic socialists today, which is that their horizon was not limited to just making capitalism less bad. They did do that. They did that very effectively. But in part, they were able to do that so effectively because they had a vision to say, we believe in democracy in all spheres of life. So I do think that that is a difference between democratic socialism and somebody who just believes that the most human beings can aspire to for the next, as long as human civilizations exist, is some sort of capitalism. I don't think that there's any reason, if you believe in democracy, to say that we should preclude the possibility of democracy expanding to the economic sphere. And even just unions are steps in that direction. So I think that the way to look at it is, in the immediate and in the mid-range, we are fighting for something like Sweden in the 1970s, a very robust universal welfare state. That would be so much better than what we have. It would alleviate so much suffering. And I think part of the problem I have with the way that Megan Romer articulated it, particularly in the New Yorker interview, was to sort of counterpose, like, we're not for gentler capitalism, we're for economic democracy. Whereas actually, you don't have to counterpose those things. You're never going to be able to get to economic democracy if you can't win a welfare state, if you can't rebuild a mass workers movement. And in fact, and I think this is the crucial point, is the reason so many people think that transformative change is impossible today, including just social democracy. It's like we have to fight hard. It sounds radical to say you're for Medicare for all, even though this is something that most of the rest of the industrialized world has. The reason that sounds so sort of pie in the sky to many people is just they don't have lived experience of that working. The government has been underfunded. They haven't witnessed collective action working. So unless we can start getting people confidence that the government can work better, that's what Zoran, what he's doing is so important. And unless we can give them confidence in their strength and in the strength of solidarity and working class struggle, if you can't do that, you're never going to be able to get to the long-term future. So I think that anything that we do that counterposes that long-term goal to the immediate fights is very, very detrimental to the cause, both in the short term and long term.
We'll continue in just a minute. till the end of the hour with Eric Blank, Assistant Professor of Labor Studies at Rutgers, a contributor to The Nation and Jacobin, author of several books, including We Are the Union, How Worker-to-Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big, published last year. And we'll get to AOC in the context of what we've been talking about, because these days she has the backing of the New York City DSA, but lost the endorsement of the national DSA. Brian Lehrer Show continues. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Today, tomorrow, and Wednesday, in this portion of the show, we're exploring, we hope in a smart way, some current divisions within the conservative movement. That'll be Wednesday. Within the Democratic Party, that'll be tomorrow. And within the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, that's what we're talking about now, with Eric Blank from Rutgers and The Nation, and author of several books. I want to ask you about AOC in this context. I see she has the backing of the New York City DSA, but no longer the national. Reading from New York Times reporting on this, it says, concerning, in the eyes of some activists, are candidates perceived to have drifted away from the movement on important policies. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, for example, who has made inroads with mainstream Democrats and is seen as a potential presidential candidate, remains a contentious topic among left-wing members of DSA, who said they still resented some of her past positions over the war in Gaza. Though the Congresswoman is one of the most outspoken critics of Israel in Congress, some on the left argue that she has not been strong enough in voicing support for Palestinians. In 2024, the national DSA withdrew its conditional endorsement of her. So, Eric, with your journalist hat on, can you describe any further what happened there in 2024?
Sure. It's just worth flagging, again, the context here, which is that AOC was, elected with a strong amount of help and is very close to New York City DSA, which has, sort of consistently been on the right wing of DSA, a mass politics wing. And so there's, again, some of these divisions really seem bigger than they are. On the ground in New York City, it's kind of a moot point. People overwhelmingly in DSA love AOC. They're very excited about her running for president, hopefully. And we haven't had this type of conflict with AOC in the places where it matters. The difference is that, again, in places outside of New York, where, New York, the leadership is led mostly by caucuses like the Socialist Majority Caucus and Groundwork. It's a Democratic organization, so there's caucuses on the left all across the country, And they, I think, if you can remember this moment, 2024, October 7th had been a year prior. We were seeing, I remember the moment. I'm Jewish and a longstanding sort of supporter of Palestinian freedom. And I would wake up every morning, seeing little kids killed in Gaza, and I find that, it was horrifying. And in that context, I think a lot of people's powerlessness got channeled not towards productive place, which would be trying to push the government and the Democratic Party as a whole to, put real pressure and through, for instance, an arms embargo on Israel. Instead, it seemed, well, if we can't do that, why not focus on someone who might actually listen to us, like AOC? And so much of the sort of anger, which I think was mostly justified, got put towards AOC in a way that I think was totally unjustified, insofar as that AOC is, as you mentioned earlier, one of the most consistent sort of advocates for Palestinian rights and freedom. And that led, to unendorsement on a national level of AOC, which I think was a mistake. I do think that
was
has
it
changed.
Largely because she continued to support funding for what's described as defensive, military funding for Israel, the Iron Dome, missile defense shield in particular, and that distinction did not fly with that wing of the party?
I do think that was one of the trigger points. To go into the actual voting record, there were some exaggerations made about what AOC did or did not vote on, which I think were sort of unfair to her. But yeah, that was certainly part of it, in which AOC, I think, in my opinion, correctly, has moved away from that and moved towards actually what I think is a totally plausible and important position, which is this: at this point, the United States government should not be funding the Israeli state doing what it's doing. And these kind of nuances between defensive and offensive in practice doesn't actually amount to much. And so both because of the urgency of ending what Israel's doing to the Palestinians and just frankly, the legibility to the American people of why is our money going towards killing people instead of towards social services at home, it makes more sense just to have a sort of a clear-cut stance on that.
Still, the Times said in Chicago at the recent DSA National Summit, strong support for Ms. Ocasio-Cortez was mostly confined to a party at a nearby bar hosted by the Groundwork Caucus, where members chanted her nickname AOC and vowed to convert skeptics to support her for president. So it sounds like, at least at the national summit, unless that's overreported, there was not all that much enthusiasm. Were you there?
I was not there in part because I have a toddler, and so I declined. But actually, I don't think at this point that this is what I was going to get to before. I don't think that there's much division on AOC these days. Even much of the left, I think, would endorse and support AOC running for president. The level of enthusiasm is certainly higher with Groundwork Caucus and Socialist Majority. But frankly, I think my overall impression, and this is where you get into impressions, it's a little tough, is that the overwhelming majority of DSA members nationally, and not just in New York City, are extremely enthusiastic about AOC, both in general and her possibilities of running. And so part of the difficulty you have with these national meetings is sometimes it self-selects to the most active people and not to kind of the people who maybe have kids and who are involved in their unions, involved in their community. So there's a tricky thing about being in a democratic organization, which sometimes the people who have most time can have a disproportionate sort of voice. And that's part of any democratic process in which some people, there's always a balance between breadth of democracy and the intensity of it. But on the whole, the big story, I think, is actually the extent to which AOC and DSA are aligned these days and the extent to which there's real enthusiasm about her.
One more call. Judith and Saugerties, you're on WNYC. Hi, Judith.
Hi. Wow. I've tried so often to get on and finally succeeded. Anyway, so I have a number of points that I'd like to make. One is that...
Make your best one, because we're very close to the end of the show.
Okay, well, I'll start with this. Why doesn't DSA ever explain its positions? For example, defund the police, which is a really bad statement. But it really was not defunding the police, but taking part of the money that is going to police departments to other services like mental health. That's what I understood it to be. But I haven't heard a single person, and especially Megan Romer, by the way. I agree with you. She is not a good spokesperson. I haven't heard anyone say that or end the Senate. The Senate is like the least democratic, small d, governing body probably in the Western world.
We definitely could do a whole segment on, of all the things on that list, looking at the Senate as a violation of the one person, one vote principle when, people in Wyoming or somewhere that has a few 100,000 people get the same number of representatives as people in California with 40 million. But on defunding the police, Eric, and this will be your last comment, we have 30 seconds, there are differences of opinion within DSA on this too, right? Some people do talk about police abolition. They use that word, whereas others, like Judith is saying, mean defund the police some and just re-weight where public money goes, right? 20 seconds.
Yeah, I think that the slogan defund the police is very confusing, and it's good that DSA candidates and most DSA chapters, I think, aren't using it because it makes it sound like you don't think any money should go towards the police in the short term. But I think it's entirely the case that, we should be funding social services and public services much more than we're funding incarceration and repression. And that, that message we have to make, and we are making it. And I think it's possible to do that without using a slogan that gives our opponents an ability to marginalize us.
Eric Blank from Rutgers and The Nation and sometimes Jacobin and his book, We Are the Union. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. So you could be forgiven for being confused about the state of the Luigi Mangione trials. Last week, as you probably heard, Mangione pled guilty to 2 federal stalking charges in the killing of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. Now a Manhattan judge has postponed his state murder trial indefinitely, while Mangione's lawyers argue the case should be thrown out under the legal doctrine of double jeopardy. That's the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution provision, which legally protects a person from being tried for the same crime twice. But maybe shortly before the guilty plea, you heard about Mangione's lawyer saying he was suffering from an extreme emotionally disturbed condition, and they would use that as a defense. Then they apparently withdrew that plan. So why a psychiatric defense and then not? Why only a stalking charge plea and not something like first-degree murder? And who are his supporters, raising money and chanting "Free Luigi" for someone who, it's not widely disputed, did commit that killing? With us now is our own Samantha Max, WNYC and Gothamist reporter covering public safety, and she's been following this case since Thompson's killing in December of 2024. Hey, Sam, welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Mike. Good morning, Brian.
And I know you go on with Michael Hill, and
yes.
It's easy.
Muscle
easy to
memory
make that, there you go. So, listeners, our phones are open for your questions about this. Have you been keeping up with Luigi Mangione's trial? What do you make of these latest updates and changes of direction? Do you have a question for WNYC and Gothamist public safety reporter Samantha Max? Are you in the Free Luigi camp and want to explain why? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692, as you can call or you can text, as always. All right, let's try to clarify. Samantha, what did Mangione actually admit to in court?
Yes, I mean, I have actually the statement that he made on Friday pulled up in front of me to make sure that I do not misstate what he said. So he admitted on the morning of December 4th, 2024, that he shot Brian Thompson, that Thompson died, and that when he did so, he understood that his actions would place Thompson in fear of death or serious bodily injury, and that he also knew what he was doing was illegal.
And you reported that Mangione pleaded guilty to 2 federal stalking charges.
Yes.
But what exactly does that plea cover? And why is it only stalking? Some people may be wondering if in that statement that you just read from him, he admitted to shooting him. I guess he put it, I shot Brian Thompson, and then he died.
Yeah, well, this is a really complicated aspect of the federal case because the stalking charges are not the only thing that he was initially charged with in federal court. He originally did face a murder through use of a firearm charge and also a separate weapons charge. And the murder charge, if he had been convicted, the federal government was planning to actually seek the death penalty against him. And his lawyers, Mangione's lawyers, they made this request to the court that those 2 more serious charges be dismissed. And after, all these back and forths in the court papers and a hearing with the judge, those charges were dismissed really on a technicality, essentially, about how the laws were written and how he was charged. So in the end, he ended up facing these less serious stalking charges. But I will say, though, given that the stalking did cause a death, the way that the federal law is written, he still faces the possibility of life in prison just for those stalking charges.
And I guess regarding what we would call stalking, he also described his own planning, researching an investor conference, posing as a potential investor, using a 3D printed gun, all of that in addition to the part that you read out?
Exactly, yes. So he described that he had broken his back and suffered for years from back pain and then also struggled with navigating the health insurance system. And he said that he had witnessed many others also struggling to navigate this system. And he said that then he learned that this investor conference was going to be happening in New York City for United Healthcare. And he said he posed as an investor working at a firm with a huge amount of assets, and that unlike his past communications with health insurance, that he had heard back very quickly with information about where the conference was happening, and that's what he used to make his plan.
Sure sounds to this non-lawyer like premeditated murder. Is stalking all he's going to be held accountable for at the federal level?
At the federal level, yes. But of course, there are still charges pending in state court. So that's kind of the next chapter of this story.
And what was the defense's legal strategy here? A lot of people were surprised to see a guilty plea at all after years of build-up and from a legal team that's been described as very competent. And I mentioned earlier the emotional disturbance defense that reportedly they were starting to use and then withdrew.
Yeah, I mean, I was speaking with an attorney yesterday who told me that in all the years that she's been practicing, she has learned you should never be surprised by any development that happens in the courts because you really never know what's going to happen. And pleas can happen even when you don't expect them. But basically, after Mangione pleaded guilty in the federal case, his attorneys almost immediately filed this motion asking for the state charges to be dismissed. And in that motion, they really kind of laid out their strategy pretty clearly and explained all the different ways that they kind of felt backed into this corner, like this was their best option. And it has to do with kind of the particularities of both state and federal law. One of them being double jeopardy. That is this idea that you are not supposed to be tried twice for the same crime. But, go ahead.
No, go ahead. But.
Yeah, I was just going to say, but, sometimes people are still tried in both state and federal court because they're considered two separate sovereigns is the legal word for it. But because they're two separate governments, the charges can be different in their substance. So sometimes you can have both of these different kinds of cases, even for what would seem like the same crime.
Again, speaking as a non-lawyer, I feel like I've seen this a number of times in, high-profile cases that have made it to the news and made it to the show where somebody is charged with something at the state level and something else at the federal level. Sometimes there's an acquittal even in one, and then the other level goes ahead with a charge. So for you as a reporter on this case, how strong does the double jeopardy claim seem to be, if you can assess it at all, because they're trying to make it so that stalking is all that he ultimately gets convicted of, rather than the potential for a murder charge, which is what the state is still trying to bring.
Right. So the next twist in this is that New York has its own law on the books related to double jeopardy, which is actually stronger than most double jeopardy laws around the country and the federal protection as well. So that is also part of the calculus. And from the different attorneys I've been speaking to in the last few days, I feel like they are very mixed. I mean, one attorney who I talked to yesterday, she said, this is not a slam dunk. This is a very complicated, nuanced issue. And there are certain hurdles that Mangione's team would have to jump over in order to get these charges dismissed in terms of, arguing exactly why double jeopardy should be protecting them, because there are certain exceptions to the double jeopardy law that could allow for those state charges to move forward. And I'll remind listeners that the state charges he still faces are second-degree murder, criminal weapons possession, a few different charges of that, and also a charge related to the fake ID that he was carrying on him. So it's now going to really be a back and forth between the defense team and the prosecution, who they very much want to still move forward with their charges. They have already put in a ton of work investigating this case, prosecuting it up to this point. They have a victim's family to, honor their wishes. So, it's really going to be a big back and forth. And we just found out from the judge overseeing that case that the DA's office now has almost 2 months to respond to all these arguments that the defense is making. And then the defense will have their own response after that. And then sometime either later this year or early next year, the judge will make the decision about whether those charges are going to stand. And then, of course, whatever decision is made, if one side is unhappy, could end up being appealed up the chain.
That's very interesting that you said, if I heard you right, that New York has particularly strong double jeopardy laws. Is that considered kind of a progressive thing because, the New York State Legislature wanted to protect defendants from being kind of abused by the criminal justice system?
Yeah, I mean, that is the purpose of these laws, is to make sure that, you're not holding someone accountable more than is just. So that is a law that has been on the books in New York, and there's precedent that has supported it. And then another kind of quirk in the New York law that contributed to Mangione's defense team decision is what you mentioned earlier about extreme emotional disturbance. So this is a defense that someone can seek at trial where they're arguing, okay, I might have done this, but this is why. This is why I should be held less responsible because I was extremely emotionally disturbed at the time. And that is something that you could only do in the state case for Mangione. That is not a defense that he could have made in the federal case because it's just not a part of the federal law. So then essentially, if the state trial had gone forward before the federal case was resolved, he would have had to admit, if he was going to use this defense, he would have to admit in state court, yes, I did do it, but, and this is why. And so then you have a case where he is admitting to doing it, but then he still would have faced another federal trial after, where he would have already essentially admitted to the killing. So his defense team was having to weigh, with the scheduling and which case is supposed to be happening first, because the state trial was supposed to happen in just a few weeks, how he was going to navigate those different elements.
One more thing on the double jeopardy aspect. Listener writes, how can pleading guilty for stalking make being tried for murder double jeopardy? Very different kinds of charges, writes that listener.
Yeah, I mean, that is really going to be the essential question that the judge has to decide. And the way that the double jeopardy law is written, one of the elements that the defense team would have to prove is that essentially the design of the two different laws are trying to prevent a similar evil, essentially, or a similar, bad thing happening. So they would have to argue essentially that both the stalking charge that he pleaded guilty to and the murder charge that he faces in state court are trying to prevent a very similar kind of bad act. And that's really going to be a question that the judge has to decide if he feels convinced by that argument.
This is WNYC, FM, HD, and AM New York, WNJT FM, 88.1 Trenton, WNJP, 88.5 Sussex, WNJY, 89.3 Netcong, and WNJO, 90.3 Toms River. We are New York and New Jersey Public Radio and live streaming at WNYC.org, coming on 11 o'clock as we talk about what might be the confusing state for many people of the Luigi Mangione case, or really cases, state one and federal one, with our public safety reporter, Samantha Max, who's been covering the Mangione story. And with your questions, 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692, call or text. By the way, what kind of punishment is he actually looking at for the stalking plea? I see that he's due to be sentenced federally on December 18th. What's the range of possibilities there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge range of possibilities. The maximum is life in prison. And this was not a plea deal where he was pleading guilty to something less serious and making some sort of agreement with prosecutors. This was him pleading guilty to what he was indicted for, the charges that, still remain in the federal case. So life in federal prison is on the table, and it could be something less than that as well. The judge will have discretion. I think his defense attorneys, the calculation that they made in their motion, that it would be somewhere around 25 to 30-ish years. But it really is a complete toss-up at this point of what it could be.
Does it look to you like Mangione's status as something of a folk hero, if I can use that term, changed at all since he pleaded guilty and admitted in his own words to planning and carrying out the killing? As we've heard before, thousands of people reached out to Mangione since the shooting in December 2024, and the Free Luigi movement helped raise money for his legal defense fund that has paid for his legal team. Have you seen that energy shift at all since the guilty plea, if you're covering that aspect of it?
You know, I cannot say for sure because certainly this group is not a monolith. And my understanding, and my colleague Walter Wuthman is doing some great reporting, is, you know, there are a lot of different feelings in the camp of supporters for Mangione. But one thing that we do know is that there are plenty of people who think that and have thought since from the beginning that he is guilty, but that they still support his actions. And I think it's really interesting that he took the opportunity during his plea hearing to say, you know, this is what happened to me with the healthcare system and this is why I did it. And I think that some of his supporters who support him because of their own feelings about the health insurance industry probably were happy to hear him say that.
We'll get back to Mangione and his supporters in a second, but going back to the state charges for just a second, which you said is the main one is second-degree murder. Mm-hmm. Listener texts, why second-degree murder instead of first-degree murder?
Yes, so similar to the federal case, he was originally facing more serious charges. He was facing a first-degree murder charge, and he was also facing second-degree as an act of terrorism. And again, his defense attorneys made a motion for those charges to be dismissed. And again, on a legal ground, those charges were dismissed.
Because of the way evidence was handled?
It didn't have to do with evidence. It had to do with the specific wording in New York statute, and particularly for the terrorism statute, you know, that is something that is not used very often, and there's a really specific definition for what counts as terrorism. And the judge did not feel that prosecutors had reached that bar to be able to keep that charge in the case.
On sympathy for Mangione, one listener writes, nobody should murder someone whose job or opinion they don't agree with. That's unacceptable and he should be held accountable. However, the despicable state of health insurance and the atrocious denials by these companies absolutely needs to be dealt with. They cause immeasurable harm. And another listener writes, pain can cause extreme emotional disturbance. If Mangione had the degree of back pain just described in the segment, then that does make sense. And I want to read, pertinent to that, something that his legal team put out. His defense attorney, Karen Friedman Agnafilo, if I'm saying her name right, speaking outside the courthouse right after Friday's federal plea hearing, quote, as Luigi explained in court today, he endured years of severe, debilitating pain following a broken back while struggling to navigate our healthcare and health insurance systems. Like the thousands of people who have reached out since this tragedy to share their own experiences, he believed the system had failed him and destroyed his life. So that from his lawyer. Is there hope that that argument would play a role in his federal sentencing?
I think that is a really good question. And the next step really in the federal case is that now each side is going to put together what's called a pre-sentencing memo, where they are going to argue for why they think this person should get a certain sentence. So, you know, on the prosecution side, they'll be arguing all the reasons why they think that Mangione should get a long sentence in this killing. But on the defense side, I think we are going to hear those arguments that we didn't end up hearing in state court about his, you know, alleged extreme emotional disturbance. I think if there are any mental health records to be found, any arguments that they can make about his mental state at the time based on his experience with his health, I think we can expect to see those in that pre-sentencing memo as they try to convince a judge to give him a shorter sentence.
Have you interviewed supporters on why they would support an apparent murderer, even if they believe the healthcare system and United Healthcare policies in particular also kill many people?
I have not interviewed them personally, but I've been around them in court. I mean, every single court appearance I've gone to for Mangione, it's like you line up for hours to get in the door, and some of that is reporters, but a lot of that is supporters. You know, people wearing T-shirts that say Free Luigi. Some supporters have even actually gotten press passes to cover the proceedings. So it certainly has been a presence in the courthouse.
Listener, right. Well, one listener writes, I am sorry to say this, but I cannot imagine a black person being given such a robust defense. People will agree or disagree with that, I guess. Someone else writes, it's a shame that someone so educated went down a path like this. Another listener writes, United Healthcare murders millions a year with a pen and denial. Another listener, kind of different from that, writes, he was not even a customer of United Healthcare. Is that true? Whatever his struggles were with the insurance system, it was not through United Healthcare in particular?
I have seen that reporting, but I honestly am not sure. But I have seen that reporting, yes.
Okay. So as we head to our last few minutes, you're in court all the time as part of your job. You've covered a lot of court cases. Mm-hmm. You're no stranger to that. Can I call it a dank little press room on Center Street?
Yes, that is accurate.
So what has this experience covering Luigi Mangione's case been like compared to some other cases?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I'll say is where this case started for me was actually during another high-profile and very controversial trial, the trial of Daniel Penny, who was accused of choking Jordan Neely to death on the subway. And it was actually while I was sitting in the courtroom at 100 Center Street waiting for jurors to make a decision in that case that we learned about Mr. Thompson being killed. And, you know, I was in a room with like the entire court press, and we're all like learning this news in real time. And then suddenly, we were thrust into this other case that had in some ways some similarities, just that this is a case that has garnered so much public attention, so much division. It is certainly not representative of the day-to-day of what I see in court, just the amount of interest, resources around it, time it has taken. There are a lot of things about it that are very different than the typical court proceedings that I follow. But clearly it has struck a chord with a lot of people and as we just heard in those listener comments, in many different directions.
Do you have any take on whether media coverage and all the public attention on this case have played a role in its outcome so far?
It's something that I have wondered about. I mean, of course, the issues surrounding sentencing and incarceration and constitutional rights and state rights, I'm sure are, the leading factor in all the decisions that are being made. But the other element of when someone takes a guilty plea is that it spares them a trial. And this would have been a very, very public trial. We had just learned actually last week that in the state case, the jurors were going to be anonymous because there were concerns about what would happen if their identities were released to the public. So, that is also a factor at hand that, going through a case like this, it's a lot of exposure for both the defendant and also for the victim's family. I
was going to end here, but I see that we just got a call from a former prosecutor who has a legal take on the case. So let's hear what Frank in Manhattan has to say. Frank, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, thanks, Brian. This is not a difficult case. This is basically, could be theoretically a one-witness case where a video technician comes on and says, do you recognize that person in that video? Yeah, he's sitting right here in the courtroom. And then they have to put on the defense or not. It's what is known as a press case in the district attorney's office. And when it's a press case, there is a lot of attention given to whether it would look bad or look good if it's prosecuted to the fullest extent. But really, they should be glad that this kid took a plea. He's obviously guilty. He's going to go to jail for life. It's going to spare jurors from having to remain anonymous. It's going to spare the city tons of money. When I still work down there, and when Luigi has a court appearance, the amount of police protection to protect him from coming into the courthouse for a court appearance is you wouldn't believe it. I can't describe how many.
I believe it.
Different.
But Frank, he's only pleaded guilty to stalking charges, which would not put him in prison for life, and they're trying to get him out of the state murder charges because of double jeopardy. So it maybe is not as simple as you were just describing.
No, the federal charge, he's going to get a long sentence. If he's not going to get life, he's going to get a long 30-year sentence, and he's going to be completely forgotten about. What he did was terrible. There's going to be a lot of argument. There should be a lot of argument around whether any other person of color or some other kid would get the same type of treatment. He's gotten a very good plea, but the resources and the amount of attention this case has gotten is ridiculous. I mean, he's obviously guilty. Obviously, there's no justification for what he did, and if he was mentally ill and he needs some mental counseling while he's in prison, some sort of counseling, maybe he gets it, maybe he doesn't. But obviously, he admitted to what he did, so it's really done and dusted.
Frank, thank you very much. Any quick reaction, Sam, to that call? And one thing that he brought up that we didn't touch on is that I guess the jurors in this case get to remain anonymous.
Yes, yeah. So that was something that we did learn in court last week, is that the jurors were going to remain anonymous, which happens sometimes in high-profile cases. I will say, for the stalking charge, he could face life in prison. It is not a guarantee, as Frank was saying, but yeah, he does face up to life in prison for the stalking charges because it resulted in a death. And yeah, I mean, there is an interesting experience about being a court reporter in New York City when you have to wait hours in line to get into a courtroom to report on something that every other reporter in the city, it feels like, is covering, whereas there are a million other things happening in courthouses around this city every single day. And I do think that what Frank is talking about in terms of this being a press case is, every court case is not treated the same. And this case was getting a very special attention because of the kind of political questions around it.
WNYC's and Gothamist Samantha Max Quality, covering public safety in and around New York City. Samantha, thanks a lot.
Thanks, bye.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Housing isn't just in short supply in New York City. It's the stuff of lawsuits and political battles. Landlords have the Mamdani administration in court now.
Although the Justice Department has published thousands of pages of the Epstein files, the quest for accountability goes on.
There are huge pages of redactions that involve descriptions of activity by other possible co-conspirators, whether they be powerful men. We don't know because they're all blacked out.
On this week's On the Media from WNYC. Find On the Media wherever you get your podcasts.
Challenging the rent-stabilized rent freeze, maybe you've heard that. Owners of million-dollar-plus second homes have the administration in court challenging the pied-à-terre tax. You've probably heard that. One high-profile lawsuit just got settled. As our housing reporter David Brand first reported on Gothamist, the long battle over Elizabeth Street Garden is over. A team of developers picked to build low-income senior housing atop the lushly green, statue-strewn lot in Lower Manhattan, David reported, has officially dropped a lawsuit it filed against the city for abruptly canceling the decade-old plan. The move on Thursday ends a long, bitter dispute that pitted pro-development advocates who highlighted the dire consequences of the affordable housing shortage against supporters of the Elizabeth Street Garden who sought to preserve the unique green space. That from David Brand's reporting. He's about to join us. One thing I want to know, does this agreement have implications for other housing construction plans where neighbors don't want new buildings for whatever reasons, right? Gardens or no. David Brand joins us now to talk about the Elizabeth Street Garden settlement and the latest developments in the non-settlement so far in the rent freeze and pied-à-terre cases. Hey, David, always good to have you on the show. There may be a housing shortage, but there's never a shortage of housing stories and conflicts, is there?
Well said, Brian. That's exactly right. Housing shortage, no shortage of housing news.
Would you remind people where the Elizabeth Street Garden is? Probably most people listening right now have never been there or seen it or maybe even seen a picture. What does it look like there, and where is it exactly?
Well, this is a city-owned lot on Elizabeth Street in Spring Street in Nolita. It is, like you described it in the intro, has a number of statues, plants, places to sit, tables, chairs. People go to relax during the day. You go in there, you see a lot of people drinking coffee. They have some events like movies, and I just saw on Instagram they had a Tai Chi session. So popular spot for people in that section of Manhattan.
Is it a community garden? When we hear garden, is it a community garden, like people in the area can grow plots of vegetables or flowers there, or more just the kinds of things you were describing?
Yeah, more the kinds of things I was describing. So I think the characterization of it as a garden is, some people find that controversial because they say, the people who supported the housing plan on that site say, wait a second, this is not a community garden. This is a city-owned lot. People have used it as a green space, have turned it into a kind of a really unique space, but this isn't a community garden like where people in the neighborhood are growing their own plants and growing their own vegetables and stuff. So some people bristle at that characterization, but it's here to stay, and it is known as the Elizabeth Street Garden.
And again, by way of background, when did the housing proposal first surface? And why there in the first place, if it was a garden or green space, which, at least when we hear that word, we think that's a rare and precious enough thing in a place like Lower Manhattan, at least in theory.
That's right. And I think for anyone, like mentioned, what does it look like for people who have never been there? Maybe people have been there or, have heard this kind of tangentially or in the background for a while. Like, why is this one specific lot in all of New York City getting such outsized attention, and why do so many people care about this? And I think it's because it has become an emblematic of larger disputes over city housing and development policy. And so that those disputes and this kind has traced this kind of burgeoning, yes, in my backyard, YIMBY, pro-housing, pro-development movement that has really sprung up at the same time as there have been these fights over what will become of this specific site. So the housing plan first began back in 2012. Then council member Margaret Chin, who represented that section of Manhattan, proposed that lot as a future site of affordable housing. She proposed that to the Bloomberg administration. The de Blasio administration picked that idea up, began planning that as a potential site for new housing, and in 2017 awarded a potential contract to develop the housing there to 3 organizations and companies. So that's Habitat for Humanity, another nonprofit called Riseborough, and the for-profit developer Penrose. That was 2017. The plan then went through the city's land use review process, the lengthy process. It involves community board input, city planning commission vote, and then finally culminates in a city council vote and approval by the mayor. So it completed that process. City council and then Mayor de Blasio approved the development there. A nonprofit group that had started as part of the effort to preserve this lot as the Elizabeth Street Garden then sued. That case wound its way through various appellate courts until 2024, when the State Court of Appeals, state's highest court, sided with the city and said development could proceed. Early in 2025, last year, the city actually issued an eviction notice to the garden, but then Mayor Eric Adams, the third mayor to preside over this plan, abruptly halted the plan for the housing and instead said, we're going to build the housing elsewhere, preserve this garden, and then shortly before leaving office, he deemed this parkland, which, according to now the fourth mayor, Mayor Zohran Mamdani, will preserve this permanently, and the city's hands are tied, and so they couldn't proceed with the housing plan there, and so they looked to settle with the developers involved. So a long history that has spanned 4 mayoral administrations while also tracing this larger kind of citywide effort to build housing versus preserve the parkland.
Right, and I think you've heard me state my Bryan's law of housing politics in New York City. Everybody says we desperately need more affordable housing, and everybody says just don't build any near me. So this is the Elizabeth Street Garden version of that. Listeners are calling in already. We know, obviously, people in the area have strong feelings about this. So, listeners, we can take some of your reactions to this settlement news. 212-433-WNYC. The Elizabeth Garden gets to stay, which means there will be no affordable senior housing on that site. Did you or someone in your family apply for one of those senior housing units that was originally promised there? If you live near the garden, how does this resolution sit with you? 212-433-WNYC. Call or text 212-433-9692. You can also call with questions about some of the other housing news that we will get into, the legal challenge to the rent freeze, or the pied-à-terre tax, or David's most recent story, headline, New York City still refused most emergency aid requests to prevent eviction after Mamdani took office. The pace of those refusals did not change from the Adams administration in the early months of Mamdani. So on that as well, 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. So on Elizabeth Street, David, bring us to the present. What exactly happened last week?
All right, so last week, as you mentioned, those developers, the development team officially dropped its lawsuit against the city. And part of this new agreement is that they will instead get the rights to develop another city-owned lot, this time at 22 Suffolk Street on the Lower East Side. This is a narrow lot. It's next to another mega development from about a decade ago called Essex Crossing. It had stayed vacant. The city was considering it as a potential site of a school. They determined that it wouldn't work for a school, and so now they're going to proceed with the housing with that same development team. But that's still several years away. City Hall spokesperson told me that they won't begin the land use review process, which takes 6 to 9 months for that site, until mid-2027. The development team still needs to put together financing, which could take until late 2028, and then we'll see from there. Development couldn't get started, I guess, until 2028 or later.
Yeah, and on the promise of a substitute site, I mean, that's kind of sketchy, right? As a legitimate conclusion to this, which is not to say the Elizabeth Street Garden should or shouldn't remain a garden, but this connects to an older argument that Councilmember Chin and others have made for years, that other sites floated for affordable housing shouldn't be treated as swaps for Elizabeth Street. They should be additional, right? Because the city is looking for lots all over the place. There aren't enough lots for the city to build on, I think a lot of housing advocates would argue. So you can't really swap not building on one for building on another, when the advocates would say, no, we need to build on both.
Right. And, if only it were that easy to just transfer all the plans and all the financing from one lot to another. Like, this is a totally different process. So the same development team is getting this lot to build on, theoretically, but it's not like they can just transfer everything that was in place at the other spot for this one. And,
and it's still a net removal of one site for affordable housing construction. I mean, that's the point, right?
Right. Supporters of the housing plan say do both. The city is in an extreme affordable housing shortage. It's especially affecting seniors, so build the housing at both sites. But, you mentioned also, is this a swap? Well, we don't know if anything is guaranteed at all, because we saw 13 or 14 years ago the planning began and was moving apace at the Elizabeth Street Garden site, and it didn't happen. And so who knows when development would actually begin at this other lot.
Here is Lisa, who says she's 3 blocks from the Elizabeth Street Gardens, calling in with what we might call a little bit of alternative history, or to fill in certain gaps in the history as we were telling it. Lisa, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Yes, hello. Yeah, I had the distinction of being on the city council staff at the point where Margaret Chin advocated for and got an agreement from the city to develop on what people are now calling the Elizabeth Street Garden. But at the time, and I think this was before 2012, maybe 2011, it was a lot that had been usurped by the businessman who had a business next door where he sold remnants of city-owned buildings, things like gargoyles or distinctive features of vacant buildings, which he stole out of those vacant buildings and put in his store, and also displayed them in the vacant city-owned lot next door. It had a fence around it. It was not accessible. It certainly was not a place where people could go and relax and view movies and musical presentations. It's just outrageous to me. I also was involved in 1970s when the site where 22 Suffolk Street is now was an urban renewal site that was slated for affordable housing all the way back to the 1960s.
That's the new site. That's the new site that's supposedly the swap site for the gardens, right?
Exactly. It's been designated for affordable housing. It is true that the community board also advocated for it to be a school, but its history as affordable housing goes back decades. And to say now we're only getting one of those two sites, as you very well pointed out, Brian, is just outrageous to me. And the last thing I want to mention is that Community Board 3 has never been consulted on the use of this Suffolk Street site. The site on Elizabeth Street is in Community Board 2. And as a former chair of Community Board 3, I find that insulting and outrageous. So you can tell from my voice how angry it makes me that this has become a citywide issue of such import. And I agree 100%.
Let me ask you, Lisa, given your history as a staffer for a city council member, as the site transitioned from being owned by a businessman next door who was using it never owned, usurped. It was I don't know what its history was. Okay.
I think it might have been part of an urban renewal effort because there's going back, it was called the Little Italy Urban Renewal Area, going back to the 60s also. But it was city-owned.
Fair enough, I stand corrected. But as it transitioned to a garden, a community space that people started using in the way that they currently use it, did it give you or whichever city council member you were working for pause when thinking, gee, we need a lot of housing, but there isn't that much community open space in that area, and look how this has developed. Maybe we should rethink this. Did that ever occur to you or the council member you were working for?
There's always a concern about that for any responsible elected official, I would argue. But there is open space in that neighborhood. There's something called the Sarah Delano Roosevelt Park. It's about two blocks away, much closer, by the way, than Suffolk Street, which is like 12 blocks away. And that is an underutilized, under-maintained, and really available place for people to use if there was a commitment to make it more attractive.
Lisa, thank you very much for your call and your point of view and your experience with respect to this issue. Going to take one more, David, before we go back to you, from somebody who's also an opponent of the garden, a supporter of the housing, and wants to put yet another wrinkle on it. Larry in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hi, Larry.
Hey, hi. Hey, Lisa just covered a lot of the ground I told your screener about. But yeah, this is public property that was appropriated by a group of people for their own use, and at the expense of low-income seniors who are a group in serious trouble in this city, as I'm sure you know, Mr. Lehrer. You covered a lot of the issues. You and Lisa pretty much covered everything I want to say. But this seems elitist. You know, that a group of people are using it for their own artistic, wonderful purposes. That's all great. That's all wonderful, at the expense of people who really need help. And you know, as Lisa pointed out, there is public space within blocks of that area. I don't live there anymore, but I did years ago. I know that area. I know Sarah Roosevelt Park very well. And there is this space. And it seems that this is just, as Lisa said, the appropriation of public property by a private small group of people. And I'm disappointed in Mayor Mamdani's administration for allowing this to happen.
Larry, thank you very much. And we'll get to why Mamdani says his hands were tied here. And David, what his actual positions have been on the Elizabeth Street Garden and housing for that site. But I thought Larry in Brooklyn there was going to name names when he said this was for the elites, because there was a celebrity factor here, right? Robert De Niro, Scorsese, Patti Smith, all weighed in to save this garden. How much of a role did that play in the outcome, as far as you can tell?
Well, they did write letters to the then Mayor Adams administration backing the garden and begging them to leave the site alone. I don't know how much influence that had, but it did kind of correspond with the Adams administration having its change of heart. That was really driven by the then new deputy mayor, Randy Mastro, who orchestrated this plan to kill the housing plan and to preserve the garden not long after that in 2025. I think those are great calls from Lisa and Larry, and that was a ton of institutional memory from Lisa that I thought was really important to add to this conversation. But it reminded me of something you said in the intro, Brian, when you talked about like what type of precedent does this set. And that's what I think has been most interesting to me about this saga. And I had been covering it and obviously paying attention to this for several years. And then I really got even more interested when Adams did reverse himself last June and killed the housing plan, because it had come after about 12 or 13 years of a succession of mayoral administrations backing this in the face of community opposition there, in the face of several lawsuits and a 5-year legal challenge that the city won, issuing the eviction notice, Mayor Adams himself going to a community town hall and getting flack from people saying, why won't you save the Elizabeth Street Garden? And saying, look, we need to build housing. We desperately need senior affordable housing, only to then reverse himself. And so that's what has been my biggest interest. And what opponents of that decision say is, well, what kind of precedent does this set for other projects in the future that communities disagree with? And if a community is well-connected or has influence or has money, do they have a leg up? Supporters of the garden will say, look, this isn't just wealthy or celebrities who are backing this. We have thousands of signatures from community members. We have working class people coming to this site too. So they don't want to be painted with that brush. But it does raise that question about the precedent.
We took 2 callers who don't like the outcome here, who thinks senior affordable housing should have been the priority for that site in the interest of dialogue, not diatribe, as we do on this show. Robin in Soho is going to articulate the other point of view. Hi, Robin.
Hi, Brian. Thank you so much for having this discussion. I live in the neighborhood. I am a senior citizen. There is so little green space for us downtown. We literally have to go to Washington Square Park, where it is packed with people. As a senior, it's getting harder and harder for me to go across Houston Street and walk that distance. Elizabeth Street Garden is near where I live. It is a community center. They have events for people to do Tai Chi and poetry and music. It has pulled us all together, not to mention the millions of people that come every year to go to that beautiful, beautiful garden. We don't have Central Park. We don't have Riverside Park. We don't have what the East Village has with a lot of neighborhood gardens. We are concrete. We have almost no trees in Soho and Nolita. This is all we have. And to lose that garden,
let me just ask you right on that specific point. The previous two callers cited Sarah Roosevelt Park as meaningful green space right in the neighborhood.
It's all concrete and basketball courts. It's dangerous. It is not a garden. It is not a real park. Obviously, I'm in favor of housing for seniors. That particular site was going to be used for developers to put in commercial spaces and maybe small apartments for a few seniors. This city has lots of spaces where you can put in housing. They should be doing that and not working with developers who are making millions of dollars and taking away nature from people who, I don't have a house in the Hamptons. I don't get to go to the beach every weekend. I live here year-round, and I would have been so depressed to lose that garden and that sense of community that we just simply don't have.
Robin, thank you for your call. I appreciate it. And there, David, I think for people who've been listening for 10 minutes or so, that really exemplifies, the callers on either side of this, how strongly and earnestly and heartfelt both positions have been.
Yeah, people are very passionate about this on both sides, and that's why it has kind of driven this bigger community or bigger citywide conversation and has gotten so much attention because we heard from Robin. She seems to love that spot, and it is a very unique place, and it is very cool, and it has a lot of people have come to really love it, and that really heightened the stakes and the tensions.
So when Mayor Mamdani says his hands were tied, what's his history on this? Did he campaign one way or another when he was running for mayor? And why, rather than celebrating this settlement, did he kind of come out with a statement that said, well, my hands were tied, I didn't really have a choice?
So listeners might recall that in the mayoral campaign last year, this did become an issue, and all of the candidates were asked whether they supported keeping the garden there or building the new housing. That was part of a New York Times interview series. And Mamdani said he supported the housing plan. He then later told the news site Hellgate during an appearance, an interview with them, that he would evict the garden if he were elected, but now says his hands are tied because shortly before leaving office, Mayor Eric Adams designated it as parkland, and so and turned it over to the Parks Department. And so if that was a legally binding decision, then the only way to reverse a parkland designation would be to have state lawmakers do parkland alienation, and so to turn it from a park back to some other use. Mamdani could have challenged the legal basis for that and saying, well, this was determined to be a site for new housing development after a public review process, and so you would need to do another public review process to determine that it's parkland. That's an argument from pro-housing supporters who say this wasn't actually legal, what Adams did. But, if you take it that it actually is and that it was determined to be parkland, it would take a lot of, I think, political capital to get the state legislature to then reverse that decision for this one site. And so he's saying his hands are tied by the decision to determine it was parkland.
And I think Bill in Jackson Heights is calling in specifically on the mayor's role, and critically it looks like. Bill, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hello, long time, first time. And I will say David Brand has kind of preempted a lot of my points. The basic idea of the lawsuit was that you can't change the permitted land use of something simply through an agency redesignation. You can't change it from residential to park. It has to go through ULURP. That was the point of the lawsuit. So as Mr. Brand said, if the transfer was illicit, you don't have to go to the state to begin with. So he could have conceded the lawsuit. My hypothesis is that it's not in the nature of executives to concede lawsuits, and if he allows that precedent, then he takes something out of his toolbox forever that he may not want to take. Again, this is just guesswork. I'm not inside his head. But as I said, he sidesteps state alienation if you concede the illegality to begin with, but perhaps he just didn't want to do that. But as I said, I have a problem with the whole idea you can just change the land use of something without going through the Euler process, which is designed to do that. So that was my bit, and Mr. Brown covered a lot of it very well.
Called Euler. Bill, thank you very much. Call us again. And David, maybe you did kind of preempt his comment when you were talking about how the state legislature would need to approve, designation of parkland in the way you described it. But anything to add as context to Bill's call?
No, I think that was great what Bill said, and did seem kind of similar to what we were just talking about the that precedent. Can a mayor just kind of unilaterally deem something parkland without the public review, and would it be up to the state legislature to take it out of the parkland designation? And we did see the state legislature do that recently near Citi Field to pave the way for Steve Cohen's casino plan.
We're going to continue in a minute with WNYC and Gothamist housing reporter David Brand, but turn to some of the other stories he's been covering, including some of the other housing-related legal battles. There's a challenge in court now to the rent freeze on rent-stabilized apartments. There's a challenge in court now on the pied-à-terre tax, and also much less noted by the general public and the general press, but I'm really glad David reported it for us here on public radio. New York City still refused most emergency aid requests to prevent eviction after Mamdani took office. That's the headline on that one. We'll get to those stories with David, and maybe your calls on those and your texts. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. A few more minutes with WNYC and Gothamist housing reporter David Brand. The rent freeze lawsuit. What's the legal argument from the landlords?
So the landlords who are suing to try to overturn the Rent Guidelines Board decision that would freeze rents for the next or on 2-year leases when people sign their new leases after October 1st. They are saying that the Rent Guidelines Board ignored data showing landlords' expenses were rising in order to kind of fulfill Mayor Mamdani's campaign pledge to freeze the rent, and they want a judge to order the Rent Guidelines Board to go back to the drawing board and to hold a new vote.
One former board member, as you report, Christina Smith, resigned right before the vote. She accused the board of, in her words, starting with an answer and working backwards to justify it. But I see that the one member of the board who voted against the rent freeze says, no, the process was independent. This is just how it came out. That might be a strong argument against the landlords in court to have that kind of witness testimony, but I don't know.
Yeah, that was an interesting point. So, yeah, you mentioned the landlord rep on the board, one of two landlord reps on the board, Christina Smith. She's a landlord's attorney. She quit the day of the vote saying that, the outcome's predetermined, that the board's just going to vote to fulfill Mamdani's goal. And then part of this lawsuit, which cites her letter to the board quitting her post, says that the Mamdani administration meddled, and they are seeking all of these documents and communications between City Hall, the top city officials, and the Rent Guidelines Board that could prove that there was some type of interference with the board, which is supposed to be an independent body. But a day after the vote, at a separate panel discussion, the one member who voted against the rent freeze is an economist named Arpit Gupta. He said that unlike in past administrations, there was no interference, and that he credited City Hall and city officials for not getting involved in the decision.
If the landlord group wins the lawsuit, what would that mean for rent-stabilized tenants who now have an expectation that they can sign 1 or 2 year lease renewals that take effect in October under the freeze as it passed?
Well, I think it would mean a lot of confusion, and it would be totally unprecedented. So, yes, people are planning their next lease decisions, sign the 2-year with no increase to their current rents, and maybe setting their budgets based on that. If the judge were to order the board to hold a new vote, that would be totally unprecedented, and we don't really know what that would look like. They could then hold a vote and come to the same conclusion maybe many months from now. Or
presumably they would come to the same conclusion. I mean, the mayor does basically control the Rent Guidelines Board, right? This was true under previous mayors. This is true under Mamdani. The mayor gets to appoint most of the members of that board. Correct me if I'm wrong. So why would the landlords come out with any different result, even if they win their lawsuit?
Yeah, it stands to reason that the same members of the same board, mostly selected by Mayor Mamdani, who defended their rent freeze decision on the dais, the day of the vote, would just vote the same exact way. So I think that could be just replicating what has already happened. I don't know if it's going to get to that point. There's an uphill argument here for the landlords to make in this lawsuit, but they're definitely trying.
What about the pied-à-terre tax? That's in court too. What's the owner's argument in that suit?
Yes, the pied-à-terre tax is in court and actually the subject of a city council hearing going on today because a group of homeowners, so to talk about the lawsuit, a group of homeowners, 2 of them actually relatives of Staten Island Councilman Frank Morano, sued the city saying that the rollout led to mass confusion because the city published this list of nearly 1 million properties and owners and property values where they said these properties could be theoretically subject to the tax, and that caused confusion for a lot of homeowners. In reality, the city ended up sending out notices to about 17,000 property owners, notifying them that they might be subject to this tax and giving them instructions on how to apply for an exemption. So far, according to court documents, about 2,000 property owners have had exemptions approved. So now we're down to about, 15,000 properties that could be subject to this tax. The initial estimate from Governor Hochul and state lawmakers is that it would apply to 13,000 luxury empty second homes, and specifically luxury second homes worth $5 million in the case of standalone, single-family, two-family homes, or $1 million in the case of co-ops and condos.
That's an important distinction that maybe doesn't get enough press. The pied-à-terre second homes, those that are actually second home pied-à-terres that are not people's primary residence, but just pied-à-terres they maintain in the city. Most of the initial news coverage said this would apply to those homes worth $5 million or more. But if it's a co-op or a condo, it's only $1 million or more. Do you know what percentage of the pied-à-terres those are? Because what kind of apartments are there in the city besides co-ops and condos that people own for the most part?
Yeah, I don't have an exact percentage, but most of these properties are going to be condos and co-ops that are sitting empty.
Now, one argument, or one, I guess, what's the right word? Positive side effect, maybe, of the pied-à-terre tax and the spotlight that the state is putting on who owns what where in the city and what things are second homes, is that it turns out to also be a vehicle for the state to catch tax evaders, people who actually do live in the city because they're now going to claim exemptions, right? No, this isn't a pied-à-terre. This is where I really live. But aha, you pay income taxes in another state.
Yeah, exactly. It'll catch those tax cheats who, for income tax purposes, maybe say they live in a lower tax state like Florida or North Carolina, but then turn around when they are told they're going to be having to pay more on their second home in New York, say, no, actually, I live in New York. This is my primary residence. And then they're kind of in a bind. The Department of Finance could say, well, oh, you live in New York City? Why are you paying taxes in some other state?
What's the the owners, I should say, the pied-à-terre owners' argument in court here that, well, what would it result in, I should say, if they win the case?
Well, right now, their argument isn't challenging the tax per se. It's challenging the way the city went about implementing it in kind of a somewhat chaotic way, where they published this list of all these properties, got people worried, like, why is my address on this new list that just got published? Am I going to be subject to this tax? And because of that, they want to slow the implementation, have the city tailor the number of properties that actually are subject to it, and then to remove that list of addresses and property owners' names. I will say, though, that state law does require the city to publish their tax roll annually, and all of this information is already public. I think the difference here, though, is that it never gets this much attention. Mayor Mamdani was tweeting about, I think he said something like, property owners, check your mail because you're going to get this notice if you own a luxury second home. And the city put out a press release. And so that shed a lot more light and more attention on this list. And so people felt, sort of that it was an invasion, and also were wondering, wait, am I going to get this notice too? I live here.
I heard you mention the city council hearing on the pied-à-terre tax taking place today. Maybe we'll get to ask City Council Speaker Julie Menon about that when she comes on to launch the Speak with the Speaker series tomorrow morning. But I see you just dropped a new article on Gothamist about that hearing with the clever, though people will have to translate from the French, headline of Pied absent-terror. Pied absent-terror. Council members plan to read questions aloud despite Mamdani administration no-show. So you mean City Council is holding a hearing on the pied-à-terre tax? They wanted the Mamdani administration to send somebody to testify, and they refused?
Yeah, and so the Mamdani administration is not sending any representatives to testify. They are citing that ongoing litigation. I talked with Gail Brewer, a longtime politician here in New York City, and
council member.
Council member, and is now representing the Upper West Side. And she says that she plans to read 11 pages of questions into the record and will then send it to City Hall and Department of Finance to get answers to these various questions. But yeah, it should be kind of a weird hearing, questioning.
Why won't they send
chairs.
someone to answer the questions at a public hearing?
Well, that they are citing the litigation. Councilmember Brewer says, well, you can answer the questions that aren't directly related to the litigation, but that's the Mamdani administration's position, that they're not going to show up. We've seen this a few times in the past, and it seems to usually involve the NYPD. In 2023, NYPD under Eric Adams didn't testify at a hearing over the controversial strategic response group. And then in 2020, under de Blasio, NYPD didn't show up to testify about their response to the George Floyd protests, pretty violent response from the NYPD there. But this is the first time we're seeing it under the Mamdani administration.
And one more topic before you go. You've also been reporting on the one-shot deal. That's the emergency rent assistance program that tenants could turn to when they're about to be evicted. Your reporting found the city is still rejecting something like 3/4 of those applications, even after Mamdani took office. Given this and everything we've been talking about, what are we seeing about this administration's ability to actually deliver on housing, in this case, relief from eviction, and why, given Mamdani's politics versus Eric Adams' politics, would the rate of approving those applications not have changed?
Well, that's a great question. And so for listeners, the One Shot Deal program is an emergency cash grant for people who, can apply for this for a range of reasons. They owe utilities, they owe moving expenses, or the most common one is that they owe back rent. And so if they're in housing court facing eviction, the first thing they'll often do is apply for a one-shot deal to cover their arrears and stay housed. The city does end up approving these often. Thousands of people get these one-shot deals and avoid eviction, but the city is also rejecting 75% of applications that they receive. That's basically flat under Mamdani compared to what it was under Mayor Adams, and the rejection rate has actually increased pretty significantly in recent years. In 2022, they rejected about 62% of people. Prior to that, they were rejecting about 30% of people. But now they are at the 75% rejection rate. And so I don't think this is something that the Mamdani administration has really spoken about publicly or really focused on yet. But it could be a big problem if people facing eviction are having to jump through a lot of hurdles to get this emergency aid to stay housed.
Well, what's the standard supposed to be for having emergency eviction relief approved?
Well, there's a couple things you need to do. You need to submit your application with a lot of identifying and income documentation. You need to conduct an interview with someone from the city social services agency, and then there's a 30-day period where the case stays open, and after 30 days, the city can just automatically close the case if something's incomplete or if an interview hasn't been completed, or sometimes there are errors that lead to these improper denials. To get this money, you have to prove your future ability to pay rent so that the city isn't covering your arrears, and then a year later you're back in the same position with even more money owed. You also need to show that your apartment is affordable, meaning that typically that would mean some type of affordable housing or rent stabilized housing where the rent's not going to jump up and you're going to be in the same position again, unable to pay rent. So there are standards for these, and in some cases people are required to pay the money back over time, but we are seeing the rate of rejections just skyrocketing.
WNYC and Gothamist housing reporter David Brand, thanks for your reporting always on all these things that you've talked about today. In this case, David, thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Brian.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, David Hogg, and more still to come. Stay tuned. Thanks for listening to Brian Lehrer Weekend. We're back on the radio Monday morning at 10 a.m. In the meantime, follow us on Blue Sky at The Brian Lehrer Show, where there's always a conversation 24/7.